Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 12, Section 1, The Rise of Industry. And really, Chapter 12, we're going to talk about how our nation really was industrialized very quickly following the end of the Civil War. One of the things that we want to start with is the fact that, the Industrial Revolution actually had been going on for some time, starting really before 1800 in England. But really, it's the Civil War that kind of changes everything. Millions of people after the war left the farms and they started moving to other parts of the country. They started looking for work in mines or factories. And as a result of that, we're going to start kind of transitioning from an agrarian society to an industrial society. So, number one, by when had Americans transformed the United States into the world's leading industrial nation? And that was by the late 1800s. Really, before this period of time, it was England that was kind of the dominant industrialized nation. But really, after the war, the United States becomes really a world power when it comes to industry and business and such. And as a result of that, our economy booms. How much larger was our gross national product? Just so you understand, gross national product that's like all the money made by our nation within a period of 1 year. Okay, how much larger was it in 1914 than at the end of the Civil War in 1865? And for the most part, it was about 8 times greater. Taking a look at this graph below, this is really from 1914 to about 1939, and you can kind of see the rise and maybe the dip when you talk about a few economic downtimes, maybe following World War One, and then again following the crash of the stock market around 1930. But looking at this graph, you might get a better indication. Starting around 1860, our country is kind of rebuilding itself. We get to about the 1880s, and it is a huge boom. Until we get to about the 1930s, we take a dip, and then we're on a huge climb again up until the present day. So, needless to say, our country has done well for itself on an industrial note. Number three, how did the railroads help the nation develop? Well, the railroads were there for transportation. They took miners and settlers west. They brought resources back to the east. But you got to remember that railroads were also huge consumers of some of our natural resources. We used a lot of timber to help build our tracks, and iron would be turned into steel for the rails, and not only that, but to build some of the cars and the locomotives. To fuel those locomotives, we were using things like coal. So, in a way, by running those railroads and building lots of them, we're going to need to go out and cut down more timber and to mine more coal and to mine more iron ore and to turn that into steel. So in a way, it helps kind of push the growth of our nation. Number four, what product was petroleum turned into for use in lanterns and stoves? And the product is kerosene. Before this period of time, lamps and homes were actually fueled by whale oil, which was really expensive because it was so hard to obtain. But as we start using kerosene, the product comes down in price. And it actually leads to a lot of people being able to light their homes at night, kind of changing our lifestyle here in the United States. When we talk about petroleum and where it was found, the original oil well, that kind of led to kerosene being refined and such, actually was drilled in Western Pennsylvania in 1859. This is prior to the Civil War. But, by the end of the 19th century, as we're moving into the 20th century, we're going to have oil areas throughout the United States. And we're going to be not only looking for oil in kind of Western Pennsylvania, but we're going to move that oil production down to places like Texas. Number five, how did a growing population help the nation's industrialist? Well, it helped the factories because it led to increased production. Some of that is because we have more consumers for these products, but the fact that our population is also growing at this period of time, and we're becoming, maybe a little wealthier as a result. Speaking of population, if you take a look at our chart here to the side, on the right hand side, you can kind of see that we're getting a lot of immigrants coming into the United States, really from the 1870s into about 1910. And as a result of that, we're going to have a huge population boom. So, how many immigrants arrived in the United States between 1870 and 1910? Roughly 17 million people, which, literally triples our population between 1860 and 1910. And as a result, we've got lots of large families. Part of that being the fact that, our medicine is improving, living conditions are improving. So there's a larger number of children surviving into adulthood. Along with that, we've got all these immigrants that are coming in from places like Europe and even Asia, particularly China, because of social and economic conditions that are happening elsewhere in the world. So that's going to definitely change America as far as how we're going to look and how we're going to get along with one another. Let's talk about new inventions. One invention is the Thomas Alva Edison's laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, produced. Edison is known for his phonograph, an electric generator. He created some batteries, but probably most famous is his light bulb, the dictaphone, and eventually the motion picture movie machine. Phonograph was invented in 1877. It's probably one of his first. The electric light bulb comes around in 1879 and eventually leads Edison to be involved with creating the electric generator, basically to create a power plant in New York City. And this leads to the creation of what is known as the Edison General Electric Company in 1889, today known as General Electric. So Edison was a pretty outstanding fellow, but he wasn't alone. Guys like Alexander Graham Bell and his assistant Thomas Watson, in 1874 they started working on the telephone and kind of had it perfected by 1876, and that company is going to lead to the creation of AT&T. You have guys like George Westinghouse, who was an engineer who designed really the air brake system for the railroads, which allows, rather than for individual cars on a train and even the locomotive to have handbrakes, what's going to happen is you're going to have one continuous brake system, and when the brake is applied, it is applied on all the locomotives and cars equally, and it leads to really a safer railroad system as a result of that. Not only that, but Westinghouse invented what is known as alternating current, or AC, as a system to distribute electricity using transformers and generators. And one of his partners was a guy named Nikola Tesla. So, needless to say, there were a lot of brilliant minds working very hard during this period of time. One innovation changed the textile industry, and probably the big ones here were the power-driven sewing machines and the power loom. The loom that you see pictured here, this leads to threads being woven. And matter of fact, it uses a kind of a binary system that's very similar to when we talk about binary codes that we use for programming computers. The power-driven sewing machine is going to lead to the mass production of clothing. Got to remember, a lot of clothes that were made kind of leading up to this period of time were very expensive, and most people didn't have a lot of clothes to choose from. They didn't have closets and dressers full of all sorts of outfits to wear. So as a result of this, moving on to number 9, we're going to start seeing standardized sizes in clothing. And part of that is because, number one, we have these large factories that can actually mass produce clothing. And what we're going to find is ready-made clothes. And to go to a shop to say, I need a shirt, if you kind of roughly know your size, you can go in and buy one of these ready-made shirts. This is great in the American West, particularly among mining communities, because of the fact that a lot of times there weren't a lot of women around to sew clothing. Men could go in and buy a shirt, and for the most part, it would fit or be very close to fitting. We can kind of thank the Civil War for part of this because of the need to make uniforms very rapidly. This whole movement of finding power driven looms and sewing machines really comes out of that period of time. What effect of mass production had on shoemaking? You see a cobbler here, but cobblers, for the most part, disappeared. There really isn't going to be a need for that because now we're going to have factories that can go in and make kind of standardized sized shoes, just like we do with other clothing. Moving on. Number 11, what did the laissez faire supporters believe about the role of government in the economic system? I want to talk a little bit about what laissez faire is. And laissez faire is a French phrase that basically translates back to allowed to do. Okay, that government shouldn't interfere with the economy. What it should do is protect property rights and kind of maintain the peace. It relies a lot on what we call supply and demand in economics. And supply and demand, basically, according to a person who loves laissez faire, would regulate all the wages and prices within your economic system. So, what did these supporters believe about the role of government? Government shouldn't interfere with the economy, protect private property, maintain the peace, and that's about it. If you're a believer in the free market economy, this is the stuff that you believe. And today, politically, this kind of lines up probably with more the Republican Party than it does with the Democrats. But free market, according to those who like laissez faire, would provide greater efficiency, and with greater efficiency, you're going to have greater wealth and greater satisfaction among your population. People who are supporters of laissez faire, they believe in things like low taxes, limited government debt, and that private individuals should be making the decisions about, how our nation's wealth should be spent. So, who are the people who risk capital in order to organize and run a business? And these people are known as entrepreneurs. These are people that have a lot of ambition, they have a lot of capabilities. But again, this idea that they're willing to take risk is really kind of the key component here. Guys like Andrew Carnegie, Thomas Edison, and John D. Rockefeller are great examples of entrepreneurs that kind of emerge from this period of time. And they're going to become some of the most powerful individuals economically when we talk about their names and their investments. Where were vast tracts of land that Congress gave to the railroads? And most of these were in the American West, particularly when we talk about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Congress, for the most part, invested a lot of money, and they gave away about $65 million at that time worth of land. And they also sold some public lands to miners to basically establish, coal mines, copper mines, gold mines, you name it, lower than their market value. And as a result, what we're going to have is a pretty wide stretch of land that has now come into private ownership. Number 14, how was the United States different from Europe in regards to the ideas of a tariff? And just so we understand, a tariff is a tax that you place on goods, particularly goods that you're importing into your nation. And the United States, and it kind of dates back to the American Civil War, we had fairly high tariffs. And part of this was because of this Morrill tariff that was passed in 1861 after many members of the South, particularly members of Congress, left to go and form the Confederacy. Part of that was because a lot of Northerners had favored high tariffs because they thought it was going to protect manufacturing and, in a way, lead to federal subsidies that were going to help build like the infrastructure, like building canals and roads and railroads. Whereas Southerners really wanted low tariffs so that they could sell their goods overseas. Okay, so the Morrill tariff, for the most part, pretty much tripled the tariffs on American goods, which was kind of devastating to certain industries. What do laissez-faire supporters believe about tariffs? Well, if they're a believer in, free markets and competing companies leading to greater efficiency and wealth, for the most part, they probably would not necessarily be big supporters of these huge tariffs because it contradicts laissez faire. So, number 16, how did high tariffs hurt many Americans? Well, it hurt their company's profits, but in a sense, it made a lot of goods very, very expensive. And as a result, if you're looking for the best deal, sometimes Americans were not getting it because of the fact that we had these high tariffs. If you were a farmer living in this period of time, it would be harder to sell your goods outside of the United States because they were going to be heavily taxed once they ended up in places like England. Thank you very much.